The lantern burned like a small sun against the black belly of the Nevada night, and Edgar Bailey saw it from the ridge on the 365th day, just as he had seen it on every other night before, and something in his chest cracked open like dry earth after rain. He had been riding the high country for the better part of 2 years, moving between ranches and mining camps and the kinds of places that welcomed a man who asked no questions and expected none in return. He was 31 years old in the autumn of 1878, lean and sun-darkened, with hands calloused from rope and reins and a quiet in his eyes that most men mistook for coldness. It was not coldness. It was something closer to grief, though he could not have named it that way himself. He had simply been riding, and the riding had become a kind of answer to questions he never let himself ask. The ridge above the Merriweather property gave a clear view down into the valley where a modest homestead sat between two old cottonwood trees. Edgar had first noticed the light nearly a year ago, when he had been camped on that same ridge, sheltering from a bitter October wind, watching the dark valley below the way a man watches things when he has nowhere urgent to be. Most of the valley had gone dark by 8 o'clock. But one small window in that homestead had kept its lantern burning all through the night. He had thought nothing of it then. Ranchers kept odd hours. Children got sick. Bread needed baking. He had pulled his bedroll tighter and slept with his back to the wind. But when he had passed that way again in November, camped above the same valley on his way back from a job moving cattle near Elko, the light was there again. Same window. Same steady, unwavering glow against the dark. He had watched it for a long while that night, and a strange feeling had come over him, something he could not name, something that felt like standing at the edge of something warm. Month after month through the winter, Edgar had found himself returning to that ridge, not always on purpose. That was the part that troubled him the most later when he tried to make sense of it. He would find himself up in the high country, and the trail would fork, and he would take the fork that led toward that particular ridge without consciously deciding to do it, the way a horse finds water by something older than thought. January had been brutal that year. Snow had come down hard across the Nevada high desert, and the valley below had been white and still as a held breath. But the lantern had burned. Through blizzard and frost and the kind of cold that made the air itself seem fragile, that small light had held its place in the window. He had sat on his horse in the snow on the ridge above and watched it for a long time. There was no reason for it, and somehow that absence of reason was the most compelling thing about it. By spring, he had come to regard it as a kind of fixed point in his life. Not a destination, not quite, but an anchor. When everything else in his days was motion and uncertainty, that light in the valley was permanent. He did not know who lived there. He did not know what the light meant. He only knew that it burned every night without fail, and that watching it from the ridge had become something close to the most honest thing he did. It was on a night in early October, exactly 1 year from the first time he had noticed the light, that Edgar finally rode down from the ridge. He had spent the day helping a rancher named Holly's Cutter move a small herd from summer pasture to lower ground, and afterward Cutter had paid him fairly and offered him supper, which Edgar had eaten quietly at a long table with Cutter's wife and 3 children. Afterward he had ridden north without any real plan, and when the fork in the trail had come up, he had taken the high road without hesitating, and he had ridden up to the ridge in the dark, and he had sat on his horse and looked down at the lantern burning in the widow's window. Only this time something was different. He could not have explained it clearly, but something had shifted in him between the seeing and the usual turning away. The light looked the same. The homestead looked the same. But something in Edgar Bailey had run out of road, and when he felt the reins loose in his hand he realized he had already made the decision, even if his mind had not caught up yet. He rode down. The trail from the ridge to the valley floor was steep in places and dark, and his horse, a steady roan gelding he called Rook, picked his way down carefully. The night was cool and smelled of sage and the dry, ancient smell of Nevada desert. Somewhere out in the dark, A coyote called once and went quiet. When Edgar reached the flat ground of the valley, he slowed Rook to a walk and approached the homestead from the south, keeping to the edge of the road. The house was modest but well-maintained. The fence posts were straight. The garden beds alongside the porch had been turned and put to rest for winter. Someone who cared about what they had built lived here. That was clear. He stopped at the gate and sat there for a moment, holding the reins and feeling suddenly uncertain. He had ridden down from a ridge in the dark toward a light in a stranger's window. He had no good reason to be here and no proper explanation to offer if someone came to the door with a rifle, which would have been entirely understandable. But the lantern in the window burned on, steady and clear, and Edgar Bailey got down from his horse. He looped Rook's reins over the fence post and walked to the front porch. The boards did not creak much. He stood at the door for a moment, his hat in his hands, and then knocked twice. There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps, cautious and deliberate. Then silence, as if someone was standing just on the other side of the door listening. "Who is it?" The voice was a woman, steady, not afraid but careful. "My name is Edgar Bailey," he said. "I was riding past from up on the ridge. I saw your light. I don't mean any trouble, ma'am. He stopped. I just wanted to know you were all right." Another pause, longer this time. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened. The woman who stood in the doorway was perhaps 28 or 29 years old, with dark hair that had been pinned back, but was coming loose in places after a long day. She had a face that had known both sun and sorrow, strong cheekbones and dark eyes that were taking him in with a calm thoroughness that reminded him of the way experienced ranchers looked at horses, measuring and steady and without pretense. She was holding a small oil lamp, not the lantern in the window but a personal one, and its light made her face warm. She looked at him for a long time. "Edgar Bailey," she said slowly, as if testing the sound of it. "Yes, ma'am. You said you saw my light." "I did." "From the ridge?" "Yes," she considered this. "That ridge is a long way up." "It is," he agreed. She looked past him at the gate where Rook stood patiently in the dark. Then she looked back at Edgar. "Have you been watching my light before tonight?" He could have lied. It would have been the socially easier thing to do, but something about the directness of her question made lying feel wrong, and Edgar Bailey had long ago grown tired of saying things that were not true. "Yes, ma'am, I have. For about a year now." Whatever she had expected him to say, it was not that. He could see it in the small shift of her expression, not fear, not anger, but something more complex than either. She studied him for another long moment. "You had better come inside," she said. The house was clean and warm, heated by a cast iron stove in the main room. There was a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the window where the lantern sat on its sill, and shelves with books and preserving jars and the small practical accumulations of a life lived carefully. A braided rug on the floor, a framed piece of needlework on the wall. Everything spoke of a person who had made the best of what she had and asked for nothing that was not earned. She set her lamp on the table and gestured to one of the chairs. Edgar sat down, settling his hat in his lap. She poured 2 tin cups of coffee from a pot that had been sitting on the back of the stove, and she sat down across from him, and she looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "My name is Abigail Merriweather," she said. "My husband Thomas died 14 months ago. He was thrown from a horse mending fence along the north pasture, broke his neck." She said it plainly, without the particular brittleness that sometimes came with fresh grief, but with the careful precision of a woman who had made herself say the words enough times that they no longer ambushed her. "I've been keeping the lantern burning in the window since 2 nights after he was buried." Edgar sat with this. "Why?" he asked, and then immediately felt the inadequacy of the word. But Abigail did not seem to find it inadequate. She looked at the lantern in the window, its steady flame small and certain. "When Thomas was alive and came home late from the range, I always left a light so he'd know the way in. After he died, I kept on doing it." She paused. "I wasn't ready to put it out. I don't know how else to say it. I just wasn't ready." "I understand," Edgar said. She looked at him. "Do you?" "I think so," he said. "I think some things just take the time they take." The room was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside, the coyote called again, further away now. "You've been watching that light for a year," Abigail said. "From up on that ridge. What were you looking for?" It was a good question, a hard one. Edgar turned his hat in his hands and thought about it carefully. "I'm not sure," he said honestly. "At first I didn't know there was anything I was looking for. Then after a while I started to think maybe I was just making sure whoever was keeping that light had reason to keep it." Abigail was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And what did you decide?" "That I needed to come down and ask." She looked at him for a long time, and the expression in her eyes shifted into something that was not quite a smile but held the warmth of one. "That's an honest answer," she said. "I try to be honest," he said. "Most men who ride through here tell me what they think I want to hear. They offer to buy me out, or they offer their condolences, and they look at my fence line the whole time they're saying it." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "You're different." "I don't want your land," Edgar said. "I can see that." She tilted her head slightly. "What do you want, Edgar Bailey?" The question hung in the warm air of the room. Edgar met her eyes steadily. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I think I'd like to find out if you'd allow it." Something moved across her face then, something careful and wondering, like a door opening on a room that has been closed for a long time. She was quiet for what felt like a full minute. "You can bed down in the barn tonight," she said at last. "It's late and that ridge road is poor in the dark. There's clean straw and you can water your horse at the trough." She paused. "If you're still here come morning, I could use some help with the fence on the north end." "I'll be here," Edgar said. He meant it in a way that went beyond the morning, though he did not say so. And something in the way she looked at him when she handed him a blanket at the door suggested that she heard more in those 3 words than just his agreement to fix a fence. He slept in the barn that night, on clean straw, with Rook warm and settled in the stall beside him. Through the gap between the barn door and its frame, he could see the lantern burning in the window, the same light he had watched from the ridge for a year, and now he was close enough to feel the night it inhabited. He fell asleep easily, for the first time in longer than he could remember. Morning came in silver and cold over the eastern hills. Abigail was already up when he came to the house, smoke rising from the stovepipe, the smell of coffee and cornbread coming through the door she had left half open. She was in her coat at the fence line when he found her, examining a section of posts that had heaved from the frost and left the wire sagging. "Winter did a number on it," he said, crouching to look at the base of a post. "It does every year," she said. "Thomas always saw to it in spring. I got it mostly managed, but this north section keeps going on me." They worked together that morning with a comfortable silence that surprised them both. He drove posts and she strung wire, and when they spoke it was in the short, practical language of people working toward a shared goal. He noticed the way she worked without complaint, and without asking for help she didn't need, only accepting it when it was useful. By noon the fence was solid. They walked back to the house and she made a meal of salt pork and beans and more cornbread, and they sat at the table in the midday light and talked more freely, the way people do when they've worked beside each other and established a basic trust. He told her he'd grown up in Missouri, that he'd come west after the war, that he'd worked cattle and horses and odd jobs across Wyoming and Utah and Nevada, never staying long anywhere. She listened without interruption, which he appreciated. She told him that she and Thomas had come to Nevada from Ohio 6 years ago, that they had built the house themselves with help from neighbors, that she had a son named Samuel who was 7 and was at school in the small town of Calder's Creek 4 miles east. "He comes home Friday evenings and goes back Monday mornings," she said. "He boards with the Hartley family during the week. It's a kindness they've done us." She said this with a small tightening around her eyes that told him what the arrangement cost her, even while she understood its necessity. "You're here alone the rest of the time," Edgar said. "I am," she said. "I manage well enough." "I didn't say you didn't," he said. She looked at him across the table with that measuring look again. "No, you didn't," she said. "I apologize. People usually say it like it's a problem that needs solving. Some people can't tell the difference between a person who is alone and a person who is lonely," he said, Abigail set her fork down slowly. "Are they different things in your experience?" "Yes," he said. "I've been alone most of my life. I've only been truly lonely a few times." He paused. "The loneliness comes from being unseen. Being alone is just geography." She was quiet for a moment, and he thought he might have said too much, gone too deep too fast for a woman who had only opened her door to him the night before. But when she looked up at him, her eyes were very clear. "I've been lonely," she said quietly. "Not always, but lately. Not because Thomas is gone, exactly. It's more that." She searched for the words. "He saw me, in the particular way a person needs to be seen, and since he's been gone, I've felt like I'm somewhat out of focus." Edgar nodded. He understood this completely. "You said you've been watching my light for a year," she said. "Did you see me from up on that ridge?" "I saw your light," he said carefully. "I didn't know you, but I saw that someone was keeping faith with something, and that seemed worth witnessing." Abigail Merriweather looked at him for a long time, and something in her expression shifted like a landscape does when a cloud moves off the sun, slowly and completely. "Would you like to stay on a while?" she said. "There's work that wants doing, and I pay fair wages. Samuel comes home Friday. He's a good boy." She paused. "I'm not offering anything else, I want to be clear." "That's perfectly clear," Edgar said. "And yes, I'd like to stay." He stayed. In those first weeks, Edgar proved himself useful in the manner of a man who knew how to work, and did not require instruction in things that were obvious. He repaired the lean-to beside the barn, rechinked the south wall of the house where the November wind was finding its way through, and spent 2 days clearing the water channel that ran from the creek to the stock trough, which had silted up badly. He worked with quiet, careful competence, and he did not intrude on Abigail's solitude any more than the work required. She watched him from the corners of her attention, the way people watch things they are not yet ready to look at directly. She noticed the way he handled his horse with patient gentleness. She noticed that he always knocked before coming to the door, even after the first day, even after she'd told him there was no need. She noticed that when she was speaking, he listened with his whole face, not waiting for his turn to talk, but actually taking in what she said. Friday evenings brought Samuel home. He was a serious, brown-haired boy who had his mother's dark eyes and a thoughtful, watchful quality that reminded Edgar more than a little of Abigail herself. He arrived the first Friday to find a stranger in his yard, and sized Edgar up with the kind of unsentimental assessment that frontier children developed early. "You're working for my mother," Samuel said. "Yes," Edgar said. "Can you ride?" "I can." "My father could ride anything," Samuel said, with the particular combination of pride and challenge that a boy uses when he is missing his father badly. "I believe it," Edgar said. "He kept a fine ranch." Samuel looked around the property with the expression of someone checking that this was true. "He did," the boy said, with a quiet certainty that was more dignity than sadness, and Edgar felt a rush of respect for this small person. They were careful with each other at first, Edgar and Samuel. Edgar did not try to be the boy's friend, did not manufacture warmth or insert himself where he was not invited. He simply continued to be present and reliable, and he talked to Samuel when the boy wanted to talk and left him alone when he didn't. It was the same way he would have approached a young horse, with patience and no agenda, and it worked. By the second Friday, Samuel was showing him where the rabbits had been digging under the garden fence. By the third, he was asking Edgar to show him how to throw a proper loop with a rope. Abigail watched this from the porch one afternoon, the boy trying and failing and trying again with the rope, while Edgar stood back a little, offering corrections in a voice too low for her to hear. Something moved through her chest that was warm and complicated and slightly frightening in the way that warm things often are when you are not sure you trust them yet. She went inside and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the lantern on the sill. She had lit it again last night, as she did every night, not even thinking about it anymore, her hand going to the matchbox and the wick the way hands go to familiar things. But last night, just for a moment before she touched the match, she had paused and thought about what she was lighting it for. The answer was different now than it had been a month ago. She couldn't quite examine it straight on, but she knew it was different. November came in gray and cold. The days shortened. The mountains behind the valley gathered their first serious snow. Edgar split enough wood to see the place through a hard winter, stacking it in 2 long rows under the lean-to roof. He worked without being asked and without calling attention to what he had done, and Abigail found herself standing at the window looking at those stacked cords of wood and feeling something she had to be careful about. One evening in the 3rd week of November, after Samuel had gone back to Calder's Creek and the house was quiet, Abigail was reading by the lamp and Edgar came to the door and asked if he might come in and use the table to write a letter. His bedroll was in the barn and he had no good surface out there. She said yes. He sat at the far end of the table with paper and a pencil and wrote for a while, and she read, and the stove ticked and the lantern burned in the window. It was an ordinary enough hour, and yet she was acutely aware of him in a way that was new, not uncomfortable, just present. The way you become aware of warmth after a long time in the cold. After a while she looked up from her book. "Who are you writing to?" He looked up from his paper. "An old friend in Wyoming, name of Marcus Webb. He's wondering whether I'm alive." "Are you?" she said, and then felt her face warm because the question had come out differently than she'd intended it, with more weight underneath it. He looked at her steadily. "I'm starting to think I might be," he said. The winter deepened. Edgar stayed. He made no demands on her, offered no declarations, made no moves that were not completely honest. He was simply a presence in her days, solid and consistent and real. And gradually, the way snow melts when the ground begins to warm from underneath, Abigail Merriweather began to let herself be aware of him. She noticed that he laughed rarely but fully, a quiet, whole sound, when something genuinely struck him as funny. She noticed that he knew something about most things, having traveled so much and worked so many different jobs, and that his knowledge sat lightly on him. He never corrected people unnecessarily. He never showed off what he knew. She noticed, on the cold mornings when he came to the door for coffee before starting work, that there was a particular quality to the way he looked at her, brief and careful, as if he was checking on something important but did not want to embarrass her by making too much of it. She was 30 years old. She had been married at 23 to a man she had loved genuinely and well, and she had grieved him genuinely and well. She was not a girl looking for a fairy tale. She was a woman who had made a life with her own hands and intended to keep making it. She was not looking for rescue. But there was a difference, she had come to understand, between a person who arrives to rescue you and a person who simply sits down beside you in the life you already have and makes it larger. December arrived, and with it, a cold snap that kept the temperature below freezing for 10 days straight. The stock needed extra attention. The water trough had to be broken up each morning, and the trip to Calder's Creek for supplies became a significant undertaking. Edgar drove her to town in the wagon when the roads permitted it, and she noticed how the people there looked at him and then at her, and how the looks carried a small current of curiosity and quiet approval. Me Hartley, who boarded Samuel through the week and was the closest thing Abigail had to a friend in the valley, caught her at the general store and said, with the direct kindness that was her way, "He seems like a decent man, Abigail. A genuinely decent one." "He is," Abigail said, more quickly than she'd intended. Me smiled and said nothing more, which was the wisest possible thing she could have done. On the night before Christmas, Edgar knocked on the door later than usual, after supper but before full dark. Samuel was home for the holiday week and was already in bed, tired from the trip. Abigail came to the door and found Edgar standing on the porch with something in his hand. It was a small cedar box, rough but carefully made, with a design carved into the lid that she recognized after a moment as a lantern. He handed it to her without any ceremony. "I made it in the barn," he said, "just for something to do in the evenings. The carving is rough." She held the box and looked at the lantern carved into its lid, precise in its outlines, with small rays etched around the flame. She felt something very strong move through her that she had to hold carefully. "It's not rough," she said. "It's beautiful." He shook his head slightly, dismissing this, but she could see that her saying it meant something to him. "Edgar," she said, and then stopped. He was looking at her with that careful, checking look of his, waiting. "I have something to tell you," she said. She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came inside and stood just within the doorway, hat in hand. She set the cedar box on the table and stood beside it and looked at him. "When I light that lantern at night now," she said slowly, "I'm not lighting it for Thomas anymore." She watched his face. "I haven't been for a while. I thought you should know that." The room was very quiet. Edgar Bailey stood still, with the particular stillness that is not absence but its opposite, a complete and focused presence. "What are you lighting it for?" he asked, his voice very quiet. "I think," she said, "I've been lighting it for you." The silence stretched out between them, full and warm. Then Edgar crossed the room in 3 steps and stood close to her, close enough that she could see the line of his jaw in the lamplight, the weathering on his face, the plainness and the steadiness of him. He lifted his hand slowly, carefully, with the carefulness of a man who understands that some things require extraordinary gentleness, and he touched her cheek with the backs of his fingers just briefly. "Abigail," he said. It was only her name, but the way he said it was like a whole sentence, like a door being opened and a threshold being crossed and a hand being extended all at once. She covered his hand with hers and held it against her cheek for a moment, her eyes very bright. "Merry Christmas, Edgar Bailey," she said. "Merry Christmas," he said. He was almost smiling, which for Edgar was equivalent to most men's full grins. "I'm not going anywhere." "Good," she said. "Because I am done watching people I care about disappear." He nodded, slow and sure, and she believed him. That was the part that mattered. She had learned in the course of her life that there was a difference between words that were offered and words that were meant, and the words Edgar Bailey spoke always had a floor under them, a solidity of intention that she had come to trust more than she had trusted almost anything in a long time. The new year arrived with a thaw that turned the valley roads to mud and made everything smell of wet earth and the green intentions of coming spring. Samuel, home from school for a 3-day visit at the end of January, stood in the yard one morning watching Edgar work a young horse on a long line and said, without looking away from the horse, "Are you going to marry my mother?" Edgar kept his eyes on the horse and let it complete its arc before he answered. "I hope to," he said, "if she'll have me." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "She lights the lantern every night now for different reasons," the boy said. This was not a question. Edgar looked at him. "Yes, I know," Samuel said. He seemed to be deciding something. Then he looked at Edgar with Thomas Merriweather's valley in his eyes and said, "My father would have wanted her to be happy." He said it with the care of someone who has thought about it very hard and arrived at a conclusion he believes in. He was that kind of man. "He sounds like he was," Edgar said. "He was," Samuel said firmly, and went back to watching the horse. Edgar thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. There was a tenderness in it, in the boy's careful protection of his father's memory alongside his willingness to make room, that Edgar found deeply moving. He understood that loving Abigail meant honoring Thomas Merriweather, not competing with him or erasing him, but simply taking up the space that was his own, without asking any space to be vacated. February brought more snow, and the long evenings inside. Abigail had begun to read aloud sometimes in the evenings, books she had brought from Ohio, and Edgar would sit near the stove with some task in his hands, mending tack or sharpening blades or simply being still, and listen to her voice moving through the words. He loved the way she read, with full attention to the meaning and a kind of pleasure in the language that made even ordinary passages feel like something worth attending to. One evening she was reading from a collection of essays and she came across a line that stopped her. She read it again, silently, and then looked up at him. "Listen to this," she said. She read, "We are none of us islands, though many of us have made the mistake of trying to be. It is in the connections, however tentative, however imperfect, that a life becomes what it was always meant to be." Edgar was quiet. "Whoever wrote that had been lonely for a while," he said. "Had you," she asked, "been lonely truly?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. for most of the last few years. And now, he set down the leather strap he'd been working on and looked across the room at her. The lantern in the window burned between them, throwing its steady light. "No," he said, "not now." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she set the book down and stood up and crossed the room to where he sat, and she sat down on the stool beside his chair, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and she looked at the lantern in the window. "Edgar," she said. "Yes." "I think I love you," she said. She said it plainly and without drama, the way she said most important things, because she was not the kind of woman who dressed up truth in a great deal of performance. "I'm fairly certain I have been for a while." He turned to look at her face. She was looking at the lantern. Her profile was lit warm and her hands were folded in her lap, and she was very still in the way people are still when they have just said a thing that is entirely true and are simply waiting to see what the world does with it. "I love you," he said. "Not I think, not I believe, just the plain declarative fact of it. I think I have been since before I came down from that ridge. I just needed to know it was real and not just a light I was watching from a distance." She turned her face to his. Her eyes were very full. "It's real," she said. He took her hand from her lap carefully, the way he did everything that mattered, and held it in both of his. Neither of them spoke for a while, and the lantern burned, and the stove ticked, and outside the snow came down over the Nevada Valley in the quiet and unhurried way it had been coming down for 10,000 years. Spring arrived in the way springs arrive in the high desert, suddenly and with great conviction, wildflowers erupting along the fence lines overnight, the creek running fast with snowmelt, the air full of the green and urgent smell of things beginning again. Edgar Bailey had been working the Merriweather property for 6 months, and in that time it had been transformed from a well-maintained but stretched homestead into something that was clearly thriving. The fences were tight, the lean-to was solid, the water channel ran clean. The vegetable garden, which Abigail had expanded with high hopes, was planted and tended. There were 2 new horses in the corral, a mare Edgar had brought in trade from a rancher near Elko, and a young gelding that Samuel had already begun to think of as his own. Edgar asked Abigail to marry him on the 15th of April, 1879, on a Tuesday morning when she was in the garden with her hands in the dirt and her hair coming down from its pins. He had planned to say something fine, something worthy of her and the year they had come through together, but when he walked out to the garden and she looked up at him with her dark eyes and her face bright from the morning air, everything he had planned to say turned to ash, and what came out instead was the plain truth. "Abigail," he said, "I want to spend the rest of my days here, with you and Samuel if you'll have me. I'm not a wealthy man and I'm not a poetic one, but I am a faithful one and I will be here. I will always be here." She sat back on her heels in the dirt and looked at him with an expression that was something between laughter and tears, and then she said, "Edgar Bailey, I thought you'd never ask." And she held out her earth-stained hand, and he took it and pulled her to her feet and then held her close there in the spring garden with the mountains looking down and the creek running fast in the distance. "Is that a yes?" he said into her hair. "It is a very loud yes," she said. "It is the loudest yes I have in me." He laughed, and it was one of his rare full laughs, quiet but whole, and she felt it in her chest where she intended to keep it. They told Samuel that evening, sitting together at the kitchen table. The boy listened with his serious face and his mother's dark eyes, and when they were done he looked at Edgar for a moment and then at his mother and then back at Edgar. "Will you keep my father's name on the property?" Samuel asked. "Merriweather on the gate." Edgar did not pause. "Yes," he said. "This will always be the Merriweather place." Samuel nodded slowly. Then quietly, "You can teach me to rope better," he said. And that, in the way of a 7-year-old boy, was everything. The wedding was held on the first Saturday of June, in the Calder's Creek Church, a modest whitewashed building with a crooked steeple and good honest light through its 2 east windows. The minister was a Reverend Holt, a small and earnest man who had seen enough of frontier life to know better than to romanticize it, and who married them in plain words that felt true. Mee Hartley was there with her husband, and the Cutler family, Holly's and his wife and children, and a few of the neighboring ranchers who had come to know Edgar over the winter months. There was cake after, made by me, and coffee, and the children ran in the churchyard. Abigail wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself, and she pinned her dark hair back with two small tortoiseshell combs that had been her mother's, brought all the way from Ohio. Edgar wore his good shirt and a dark coat that he had bought in Elko, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him with such plain and uncomplicated joy on his face that me Hartley, who was a practical woman not given to sentiment, had to look away and compose herself. When Reverend Holt pronounced them married and Edgar put his hands on either side of Abigail's face and kissed her in the morning light, Samuel stood up straight in the front pew with his chin up, watching, and afterward said to me Hartley beside him, "He's a good man," with the certainty of a boy who has made a careful, final judgment. "He is," me agreed. They rode home to the valley in the late afternoon, the three of them in the wagon, with the mountains going gold in the western light and the sage smell rising from the warming earth. Samuel fell asleep between them before they reached the turn for the ridge road, and Abigail settled him against her side and took Edgar's hand with her free hand, and they rode the last miles home without speaking, with nothing needing to be said. The summer of 1879 was long and full. Edgar took on work with neighboring ranches during the busy season, helping with roundups and branding and the moving of cattle, which brought in enough money to make some proper improvements to the property. He and a carpenter named DeSoto from Calder's Creek built a proper addition onto the house, 2 more rooms framed and floored and chinked, so that Samuel had his own room and there was space for the things a growing household needed. Abigail kept her garden expanding, put up preserves in great quantities, and began trading them in Calder's Creek, where me Hartley had connections with families who wanted quality provisions. It was a life being built, not found ready-made, and both of them understood the difference and valued it the more for it. There were hard days, as there always are. 2 of the horses took sick in August, and Edgar and Abigail lost 2 nights of sleep between them nursing the animals, and lost one of them in the end, which was a blow both financially and in the way that losses on the frontier always have more weight than they might elsewhere, because every animal represents months of work and planning. Edgar sat with the dead horse afterward for a while, his arms on the corral fence, and Abigail came and stood beside him and did not try to make it better, just stood with him, which was the right thing. There were arguments, too, small and passing ones mostly, about practical matters, how much to spend on feed against how much to put by for the harsh months, how to handle a neighbor's grazing encroachment on the north pasture that had been growing worse over the summer. They argued honestly and without cruelty, and they resolved things. Edgar had a tendency to internalize difficulty, to go quiet and work things out alone, which sometimes felt to Abigail like a wall going up. She told him this plainly one September evening after he had been silent for 3 days about a bad piece of business with a horse trader who had cheated him. "You don't have to manage everything alone," she said. "I'm here, I am your partner in this." He looked at her across the supper table. "I know," he said. "I spent a long time being my own only counsel. It's a habit I'm working on breaking." "Break it faster," she said with the small edge of sharpness that was her version of deep feeling. He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." "Do not yes, ma'am me," she said. "Abigail," he said, and he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "I hear you, and you're right." It was enough. Not because the habit vanished overnight, but because he meant it when he said he heard her, and gradually over the months that followed, the silences between them were less and less about walls and more about the natural quiet of 2 people who are comfortable together. Autumn came again, turning the valley gold. 1 year since Edgar had ridden down from the ridge. Abigail lit the lantern in the window on that particular October evening with a thought about where they had been a year ago, what had been held in that small flame, all the grief and faithfulness, and the long keeping of something she hadn't been ready to let go. She stood at the window for a long moment looking at it, And then Edgar came in from the barn and saw her standing there, and he came and stood behind her, his arms around her shoulders, looking at the lantern with her. "1 year since I came down," he said. "I know," she said. They stood together and looked at the flame. "I'm glad you lit it," he said, "every night." "I'm glad you saw it," she said. She turned within his arms and looked up at his face. He was looking at her with that steady, full attention of his, and she felt it the way she always felt it, like being completely seen. "I have something to tell you," she said. He waited. "We're going to have a child," she said. The expression that moved across Edgar Bailey's face was unlike any she had seen from him before. Not his restrained, almost smile, not his quiet satisfaction, not even the warm fullness she had seen on their wedding day. This was something entirely unguarded, something that reached all the way down to wherever he had been keeping himself away from for all those years of riding and working and watching lights from ridges in the dark. His eyes went bright and he pulled her close and held her tightly against him without saying anything for a long time. "Edgar," she said, her face against his shoulder. "I know," he said. His voice was different. "I know. You're pleased." She said, though she could feel the answer everywhere in the way he was holding her. "I'm more than pleased," he said. He stopped, and she felt him searching for the word. "I'm here," he said finally. "I am so completely here." She understood what that meant coming from him, a man who had spent years being nowhere in particular, and she held him tighter. Samuel took the news with his customary gravity, considered it for a full afternoon, and then announced that he hoped it was a boy because he would prefer to teach a brother to rope rather than a sister. Abigail told him he would teach whoever arrived whatever they wanted to learn, and he accepted this with a nod that suggested he was reserving judgment. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was gentler than the previous one. Edgar's improvements to the house showed their value in the warmth that held against the cold months, and the wood he had split through the autumn kept the stove fed easily. Abigail, in her 4th and 5th months of pregnancy, moved more slowly but worked no less, which was a source of mild, ongoing negotiation between them. "You don't have to do that," Edgar would say, coming in to find her hauling water from the pump. "I know I don't have to," she would say. "I'm doing it because I want to. I am not fragile, Edgar." "I know you're not fragile," he said. "I know that better than anyone. I'm not trying to tell you you're fragile. I'm trying to tell you I would like to carry the water because I love you and it is cold and the ground is icy." She would look at him for a moment and then hand him the bucket. "You could just say that," she said. "I just did," he pointed out. "Eventually," she allowed. The arguments between them were never serious, but they were real, and that realness was part of what made the marriage good. They were two adults with strong temperaments and clear ideas, and the work of building a life together required honest friction as much as it required harmony. They both understood this, and it made the harmony sweeter when it came. March of 1880 brought a new development that tested them in ways neither had fully anticipated. A group of land speculators from San Francisco, backed by Eastern Railroad money, had been buying up property across the valley for 2 years, pressuring landowners to sell. Several families had already gone, accepting prices that sounded fair until they tried to start again elsewhere, and found that what they'd sold for didn't stretch nearly as far as the buyers had implied. A man named Cordell, a sharp-faced man in a good coat who spoke in the smooth cadences of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, arrived at the Merriweather property one cold morning in March and made his offer. It was not a small number. Edgar could see Abigail calculating what it would mean, the security of it, the relief of it, the fact that they could take Samuel and the new baby and go somewhere easier, somewhere without the particular grinding relentlessness of trying to hold a piece of Nevada desert together against weather and time and bad luck. Edgar stood beside Abigail on the porch while Cordell made his speech, and he did not say anything. He had made his view clear to Abigail the night before, when word had come that Cordell would be calling. He had said, "This is your land, Abigail, your name, your choice. I will support whatever you decide." She had looked at him steadily across the supper table and said, "And what do you want?" "I want to stay," he said simply. "I've been a long time finding somewhere worth staying." Cordell finished his offer and looked at them with the expectant patience of a man who is fairly sure he already knows the answer. Abigail Merriweather Bailey, standing on her porch on the land she had helped build from bare ground, with her husband beside her and her son's horse in the corral and her second child moving in her, said, "No, thank you, Mr. Cordell. This property is not for sale." Cordell pressed, as such men do, suggesting that the offer would not hold, that the railroad was coming through and the value would drop once the lines were set, that it was a matter of practical intelligence to take what was being given. He said it with the kind of polite implication that the alternative to selling was stupidity. "Mr. Cordell," Abigail said, with a calm that was harder than the limestone under the valley floor, "I've heard your offer. I've given you my answer. I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my property now." Cordell looked at Edgar, as men like him often do when a woman gives them an answer they don't like, looking for a man to intercede or countermand. Edgar met his eyes and said nothing, just looked at him with the level, unhurried attention of a man who is not going to be moved by very much. Cordell left. Abigail let out a breath. Then she laughed, a short, full sound. "That felt good," she said. "Good," Edgar said. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him for a moment. It was worth noting, and Edgar knew it, that Cordell would likely try other approaches, might interfere with water rights or try to buy out neighbors whose land affected access to the valley. These were not small threats. The next week saw Edgar spending time with Holly's cutter and two other neighboring ranchers, the Alvarado family who had held their land for 2 generations, and old Pete Dawson who ran sheep on the east end of the valley, making sure they all understood what Cordell's company was doing and discussing how to handle it together. There was a solidarity among the valley families that the speculators had not fully accounted for, a network of mutual aid that frontier life necessitated, and that turned out to be harder to erode than property values. It was slow and not dramatic, mostly conversations, and the careful documentation of water rights and property surveys with the county office in Elko. But it held. Cordell's company moved on to easier territory eventually, and the valley remained in the hands of the people who had built it. It was not a story that would be told with guns or high drama, and Edgar was glad of it. He was not a man who sought confrontation, and he thought there had been enough hard things in enough people's lives out here without manufacturing more. It was also true, and worth saying clearly, that the experience of watching Cordell work the valley had made Edgar think about things he would have rather not thought about. There was a family of Paiute people who had been pushed off land along the creek 2 years before, their camp cleared by the county under pressure from earlier waves of settlers. Edgar had heard about it from old Dawson, who had not been glad of it, had said so plainly, and had also said there was nothing he could do about it that he could see. Edgar had no clean answer to that either, and the absence of a clean answer sat with him uneasily. He mentioned it to Abigail one evening, not with any particular plan, just because it weighed on him. "I know," she said quietly. "I've thought about it too. A man came through here 2 summers ago before you arrived, asking about water rights along the South Creek. He was Paiute, older man, very dignified. He spoke English well. He told me the creek had been his people's summer ground for longer than any of us had been alive. And then she stopped. He just thanked me for listening and rode on." They sat with this for a while, with the knowledge that the prosperity they were building stood on complicated ground, in the way that most prosperity in the West did, layered over losses that no land deed could fully account for. "I don't know what justice looks like from here," Edgar said. "Neither do I," Abigail said. "But I think not pretending it's simple is at least a start." It was not enough. They both knew it was not enough, but they held it honestly, and that seemed necessary. May arrived, and with it the child. It was a boy. He arrived on the 9th of May, 1880, in the early hours before dawn, with me Hartley in attendance as midwife and Edgar outside the bedroom door wearing a groove in the floorboards. When the baby's first indignant cry came through the door, Edgar stopped moving and stood very still, his hand flat against the wall, taking a breath that seemed to go all the way down to the foundation of him. Me opened the door and found him standing like that and said, with the particular warmth she reserved for occasions that earned it, "Come in, Edgar. Come meet your son." He was a fine, healthy boy with dark hair like his mother, and Edgar was immediately and privately convinced, the most extraordinary face he had ever seen on any living creature. He held the baby with the careful, reverent awkwardness of a man holding something he knows to be the most important thing in his hands, and he looked down at this small, imperious, squinting person, and something in Edgar Bailey that had been sealed away for a very long time simply came open. Abigail watched him from the bed, exhausted and flushed and quietly radiant in the way she had of being absolutely present in whatever was happening. "What shall we call him?" she asked. Edgar looked up from the baby's face. "You choose," he said. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Edgar." She watched his face carefully as she said it. He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas Edgar Bailey," he said. Then he looked down at the boy again. "That's a fine name," he said. "That's a name he can carry." "Yes," Abigail said. "I think so too." Me Hartley slipped quietly out to leave them to it, and the three of them, Abigail and Edgar and the new small Thomas Edgar, were alone in the early morning light with the lantern burning in the window of the next room, as it always was, sending its steady light out into the Nevada dark. Samuel came home from Calder's Creek that Friday to find a brother installed in the house with the authority that newborns immediately assume. He stood over the cradle for a long time, very serious, examining the baby with his father's careful dark eyes. "He's very small," Samuel said. "He'll get bigger," Abigail said. "Can I teach him to rope when he's older?" Samuel nodded, satisfied. He put out one finger and the baby's hand closed around it with the instinctive grip of the newborn, and something moved over Samuel's face that was worth more than anything Edgar had seen in a long time. "Hello, Thomas," Samuel said quietly. "I'm your brother." Summer expanded across the valley, hot and long and beautiful. Thomas Edgar Bailey grew with the speed that babies do, filling out and brightening, beginning to notice the world with a curiosity that his mother said was exactly like his father's, that particular focused attention that missed nothing. Edgar carried him in the crook of his arm while he worked sometimes, the baby looking out at the horses and the mountains with deep interest. Abigail had her garden and her preserves and her books and her husband and her sons, and she had built a life that was genuinely hers, not inherited or assigned but built, brick by brick, out of hard work and real love, and the willingness to keep the light on even when the reason for it was unclear. August brought a good harvest and enough in the trading account to buy a second milk cow, which was a practical improvement that made Abigail happier than perhaps it ought to have. But she said that happiness did not require scale, and Edgar agreed. One evening in September, when the harvest was largely in and the first cool nights were coming again, Edgar and Abigail sat on the porch in the blue hour before dark, the baby asleep inside, Samuel helping Holly's Cutter's eldest boy move calves from the summer pasture and not expected back until the following day. The mountains were purple and the sky had that particular Nevada translucence that came in autumn, clear and deep as water. "Are you happy?" Abigail asked. Not with anxiety, not needing reassurance, but with the genuine curiosity of a person asking a question they actually want answered. Edgar was quiet for a moment in the thoughtful way he was quiet when he was actually considering something. "Yes," he said. He turned to look at her. "Are you?" "Yes," she said with the same directness, genuinely and completely. He reached over and took her hand. They sat for a while in the quiet. "I think about that ridge sometimes," he said. "About the first time I saw your light. What do you think about it?" "About what it would have been like if I'd ridden past," he said. If I'd taken the other fork a year later and never come down, he was quiet. I don't let myself think about it for long. Good, she said. Don't. He turned the thought over once more and let it go. Below them, the valley stretched out in the long light, the Merriweather property with its straight fences and full woodshed and the horses moving slowly in the corral. It was not a grand estate. It was not the kind of wealth that turned heads in the big cities back east. It was a piece of the difficult, beautiful West, held together by the hands of two people who had chosen each other and meant it. Edgar, she said. Yes. I'm going to light the lantern. He looked at her. She was already rising, going inside. He heard the small, familiar sound of the matchbox, the tiny moment of ignition, and then the warm glow appeared in the window beside the door, steady and clear, throwing its circle of light out into the coming dark. She came back out onto the porch and sat down beside him again. He took her hand again. The lantern burned in the window as it did every night. It was no longer a vigil for the dead, had not been for a long time. It was something else now, something that had changed in the way that grief sometimes changes, not vanishing but transforming, becoming a different thing that held the original grief inside it while being also more than it. It was a light for the living. For the man who had seen it from the ridge and ridden down. For the boy sleeping in his cradle inside. For the older boy out in the pasture who carried his father's name on a flourishing piece of land. For the woman who had kept faith with the dark for a full year and been answered. The autumn stars came out one by one above the Nevada Valley, and the coyotes called in the middle distance, and Rook shifted in his stall in the barn, and somewhere up on the ridge, the wind moved through the sage with a sound like rushing water. Edgar Bailey sat on the porch of the Merriweather place with his wife's hand in his and looked out at the valley he had found his way into by following a light, and felt, with a completeness that was new to him, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life getting accustomed to, that he was exactly and entirely where he was meant to be. The years that followed were full in the way good years are full, not without difficulty, but weighted on the right side of the scale. The property grew. Edgar took on a permanent hand, a young man named Rafael Alvarado, son of the neighboring family, who proved reliable and skilled with horses, and who, in the way of young men on good ranches, learned much and worked hard and came to think of the Baileys as a second family. Thomas Edgar, who everyone began calling Tommy almost immediately, was a child of extraordinary energy and curiosity. He walked early, talked early, and was into everything, which kept Abigail and Edgar in a state of constant, exhilarated management. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's particular quality of focused attention, and he had a laugh that could stop anyone within earshot. Samuel, who turned 9 in the winter after Tommy was born, took his role as big brother with great seriousness. He taught Tommy to throw a rope at 3, long before the boy had the coordination to do much with it, but the instruction itself was what mattered to Samuel, and Tommy seemed to regard his brother with unconditional admiration that Samuel accepted with becoming grace. In the spring of 1882, Abigail told Edgar she was expecting again. He was in the corral working with a new mare when she came to the fence and told him, and he got down from the mare's back and came to her and held her face in his hands the way he had done on the night she first told him she loved him, with that particular careful reverence that was the deepest form of his tenderness. "A girl this time," he said. "You don't know that," she said, laughing. "I hope," he clarified. "We will love whoever arrives," she said firmly. "Of course we will," he agreed. "I still hope it's a girl." It was a girl. She arrived in November of 1882, small and fierce and red-faced, and they named her Clara. She had Edgar's coloring, lighter than the rest, with reddish undertones to her dark hair, and she had from her first weeks a kind of imperious self-assurance that Edgar said was entirely her mother and Abigail said was entirely her father and Samuel said was entirely Clara, which was correct. With 3 children and a growing operation, the Merriweather place in the Nevada Valley was a full and living thing. The house had been expanded twice now, The garden produced more than they needed, and the trading surplus was steady. And they had a small reputation in the valley for running good horses, which brought buyers from as far as Elko and occasionally Reno. Edgar had found the thing he had been riding toward for years without knowing it. He woke each morning in the same house, in the same bed, with the same woman beside him, and the sameness was not monotony but anchor. It was the difference between drifting and navigating by a fixed star. He had a fixed star now. Several of them, in fact. Abigail and Samuel and Tommy and small Clara, and the land they were all building together. He thought sometimes of the man he had been, riding endlessly through the high country with nowhere particular to go, watching a light from a ridge, and not knowing enough about himself to ride down toward it. He thought about it without regret and without too much sentiment, because the way here had been the way here, and it had led to this. On a warm October evening in 1883, 5 years after the night he had first ridden down from the ridge, Edgar came into the house to find Abigail standing at the window where the lantern had always been. Tommy was asleep. Clara was asleep. Samuel was away at school in Elko now, working toward what they all hoped would be better prospects than the valley could offer a young man with his intelligence. And the house had the particular peaceful quiet that came when the children were sleeping and the day's work was done. Abigail was looking at the lantern. It burned as it always did. Edgar came to stand behind her, his arms around her the way they had stood 5 years ago on the first anniversary of his coming down. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She leaned back against him. "I was thinking about Thomas," she said, meaning her first husband, and Edgar felt no tension in it because there was none to feel. Thomas Merriweather had been a good man who had loved this woman and built the foundation she stood on, and Edgar had long since made peace with the full complexity of that. "Good thoughts?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I was thinking that he would have liked you." She paused. "I think he would have been glad." "I hope so," Edgar said. "He would have," she said, with the confidence of a woman who had known her first husband well and understood exactly what she was saying. "He always said that what he wanted for me was that I'd never be left in the dark." Edgar was quiet for a moment, holding her, both of them looking at the lantern. "You kept your own light," he said. "I did," she agreed. "But it's better having someone to burn it with." He turned her gently in his arms and she looked up at him. This woman who had kept faith in the dark for a full year, who had opened her door to a stranger who had ridden down from a ridge in the night, who had built a life from grief and hard work and love and the particular stubbornness of a person who refuses to give up on what matters. He looked at her with everything he had. "I saw your light," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm glad you did." He kissed her in the lantern light, and outside the Nevada night lay quiet and enormous and full of stars. And the mountains stood as they had always stood and would stand long after all of them were memory. And the valley settled into its autumn darkness. And the lantern in the window of the Merriweather place burned on, steady as a heartbeat, exactly as it should. The years carried them forward in the way of all good lives, with their seasons of loss and seasons of abundance, with laughter and argument and the particular closeness of two people who have chosen each other truly and daily. Samuel finished his schooling and came back to the valley, tall and serious and full of plans, and took on a portion of the property's management with a competence that made Edgar proud in a way that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with genuine admiration. Tommy grew into a boy, and then a young man who had his father's way with horses and his mother's way with words, which was a combination that served him extraordinarily well. Clara remained Clara, fierce and bright and entirely herself, and she grew up knowing that she was valued not for what she might become, but for exactly what she already was, because both of her parents had learned, by different and difficult roads, the importance of seeing people for what they truly were. They grew older together on the Merriweather place, Edgar and Abigail, gray coming into his dark hair before it came into hers, which she found quietly satisfying. They sat on the porch in the evenings of their later years and watched the mountains and the valley and talked about everything and nothing, and their silences were comfortable and full, the way silences are between people who have said everything that needs saying and know that the presence itself is the communication. And every evening, without fail, Abigail lit the lantern in the window. Not for grief now. Not even precisely for remembrance, though it held that too. She lit it because it had become the truest expression she knew of what she believed. That light in the darkness was always worth keeping. That faithfulness to the things you loved was its own purpose. That a flame kept burning steadily in a window was a kind of covenant with the world, a statement that said, "There is warmth here. There is welcome here. There is someone who has not given up." And because once, on a night in October of 1878, a man on a ridge above the Nevada Valley had seen it, and had felt something pull at him that was older than logic and truer than caution, and had made the decision, in the way that the best decisions are made, not with careful reasoning but with the whole body and the full heart, to ride down. That was enough. That was everything. The lantern burned in the window of the Merriweather place for the rest of their long lives together, a fixed star in the valley below the ridge, warm and steady, and endlessly unwavering against the enormous Nevada dark.